On September 21st, 2002, a Saturday night, the town of Red River, Indiana, population just under 4,000, was quiet, like it always was. The only sign of life came from an open field on the outskirts, where floodlights glared against the dark, illuminating a makeshift carnival that had rolled into town just 2 days earlier. A handful of rides, food trucks, a rusted carousel, and the distant mechanical hum of a Ferris wheel gave the place a strange sense of nostalgia, and maybe for some, a brief escape from the routine of rural life. For Caleb Knox and Eva Martinez, both 19, it was supposed to be a casual night out. They'd been dating since sophomore year, inseparable since high school, the kind of couple people described as meant to be, without irony. Caleb worked part-time at his uncle's garage, saving up for a mechanic's certification. Ava had just started her nursing classes at a community college one town over. They weren't running from anything. They had plans. They arrived around 9:30 p.m., parking Caleb's beat-up red Civic along the tree line behind the field. Several witnesses would later say they looked happy. Ava in a white cardigan with a floral scarf, Caleb in a black hoodie and worn jeans. A few classmates saw them near the cotton candy stand, laughing. An older couple remembered watching them pose for a Polaroid photo in front of the Ferris wheel. It was one of those nights that seemed forgettable in the moment. Just another small-town couple at a cheap roadside carnival. At 10:56 p.m., security footage from a mounted camera on the prize booth captured them walking hand-in-hand toward the Ferris wheel line. The timestamp is clearly visible. They step into frame, pause briefly. Caleb looks down at his phone, Eva nudges him, and then they walk out of view toward the ride. That's the last confirmed sighting of either of them. By 1 a.m., the carnival had gone still. Vendors began locking up, the ride stopped spinning, music faded into silence. According to the ride operator's official statement, the Ferris wheel had its final run at 11:15 p.m. He didn't remember the last riders and said it was just another couple. He claimed he didn't look at faces, just hands and tickets. The next morning, Caleb's Civic was still parked along the edge of the field, locked, keys gone. Inside were Eva's purse, Caleb's phone charger, and an unopened pack of sour candy Eva had bought earlier that day. The driver's seat was pushed back the way Caleb liked it. There were no signs of a struggle. Just a car parked under the shade of oaks, collecting morning dew. By 10 a.m. Sunday, both sets of parents had called each other in rising panic. Neither Caleb nor Eva had come home. Calls went straight to voicemail. Friends hadn't seen them. No social media activity. They missed a brunch with Eva's aunt. Caleb's brother drove to the field and found the car still sitting where it had been parked the night before. Police were notified by noon. Red River PD initially assumed it was a teenage runaway situation. Maybe they left town together. Maybe it was a breakup that turned into something dramatic. But by Monday morning, that theory began to collapse. Both teens had left behind everything: wallets, IDS medications. Eva's mom pointed out that Eva never went anywhere without her purse. Caleb's little sister, Emily, broke down crying when she found his dog, who he never left alone overnight, whining at the front door. By midweek, authorities began combing the carnival site. Flyers were printed, dive teams were brought in to search a nearby creek, carnival staff were interviewed. But the answers didn't come. A few workers remembered seeing them earlier in the night. One man said they walked by his booth laughing, sharing a funnel cake. Another thought he saw them arguing near the Ferris wheel exit around 11:20, but later admitted he wasn't sure it was them at all. No one remembered seeing them leave. The carnival, a company called Horizon Thrills, had permits in order and a long travel route, state to state, town to town. No major violations, no red flags, just a history of operating small rides in small towns, season after season. By Friday, the crew began tearing down equipment. They had another stop in Illinois the following week. And despite community protests, there was no legal reason to stop them. The Red River PD released a short statement. There is currently no evidence of foul play. But behind the scenes, that conclusion didn't sit well with lead investigator Warren Holcomb. He would later tell a local paper, "People don't just vanish from a carnival." Something happened that night. We just didn't know what the only tangible clue, if it could be called that, was the surveillance tape. It showed Caleb and Eva entering the carnival just before 10:57 p.m., clear as day. The timestamp matched what the parents knew. But hours of footage from every other camera, including the one pointed at the main exit, never showed them leaving. No one saw them walk out. No one saw them get into a car. No one saw them run. Just a quiet night in a sleepy town. And then they were gone. The carnival left town. The field was empty again. But the questions stayed. By Sunday night, just 24 hours after Caleb and Eva were last seen, both families had filed official missing persons reports. The local police treated it seriously, but quietly. Red River wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared, let alone two teenagers in a single night. Sheriff's deputies began working down the standard checklist: home visits, phone records, nearby hospitals. But every call hit the same wall: no activity, no leads, just silence. The search began early Monday morning. Volunteers gathered at the edge of the field where the carnival had been set up. Coffee thermoses steamed in the cold, and neighbors handed out printed flyers with Caleb and Ava's photos stapled to telephone poles. By then, most of the carnival had already packed up. Only a few vehicles remained: trucks hauling dismantled rides, a trailer converted into an office, and a pile of debris left behind near the Ferris wheel's former footprint. Cadaver dogs were brought in from a neighboring county. They searched a perimeter stretching a quarter-mile in every direction: fields, ditches, creek beds. Volunteers combed the woods in grids. A helicopter circled for 6 hours, scanning the tree line with thermal imaging. Deputies followed deer trails, drainage paths, even sifted through dumpsters behind the gas station across the road. Nothing. The carnival workers, still preparing to leave for Illinois, were pulled aside for questioning. Most were cooperative. A few were annoyed. They gave names, work hours, and claimed to know nothing. One man, a ride operator in his late 30s who went by the nickname Mickey, said he remembered seeing the couple waiting in line for the Ferris wheel, but couldn't recall if they actually got on. Another claimed he saw them walking near the funhouse exit after midnight, but couldn't be sure. Everyone had stories, but nothing lined up cleanly. Timelines shifted. Details contradicted each other. A few workers admitted they'd been drinking after hours and hadn't paid attention to who was coming or going. No one could definitively say when or if Eva and Caleb left the grounds. Surveillance footage offered little more than what was already known. That single angle from the prize booth, grainy, low resolution, showed the couple arriving. The rest of the park had either faulty cameras or none at all. Investigators reviewed every second of available footage. No sign of Caleb, no sign of Eva, no exit caught on film. By Tuesday, whispers began circulating through town. People started talking about the carnival workers, the carny folk, as some put it. Outsiders, drifters, people who never stayed in one place for long, the kind of workers no one really knew much about. Rumors spread quickly. Some said there'd been thefts in the past when the carnival came through. Others talked about strange men near the bathrooms. One woman claimed her daughter had been followed the previous year. Nothing had ever been reported formally, but now every bad feeling people had once dismissed was brought back into focus. Detectives began pulling background checks on every member of the carnival crew. Most were clear: petty offenses, minor drug charges. But one name caught their attention: the man who operated the Ferris wheel, listed in records as Victor Kane. His ID was out of Ohio, no priors. But when police returned to re-interview him Wednesday morning, they found his trailer locked from the outside. He was gone. At first, no one thought much of it. Workers were constantly moving in and out, helping load equipment, shifting trucks. But by the afternoon, the carnival's manager admitted they hadn't seen Kane since the night of the disappearance. His tools were gone. His bed hadn't been slept in. He'd left no forwarding contact, no paperwork, no resignation. Just vanished. Authorities flagged his name. An interstate bulletin was issued. A description was released to surrounding law enforcement: medium build, sandy hair, scar on left temple. As far as anyone could tell, he didn't own a car. Yet, he was gone. In the absence of answers, detectives turned their attention to the teens' personal lives. They searched Ava's room, nothing unusual. Journal entries about college, nursing classes, birthday plans with her mom, no signs of stress. Caleb's laptop history showed car parts, job searches, guitar tabs, no secret conversations, no fights, no plans to leave town. Their bank accounts hadn't been touched. Phones were off the grid. Investigators questioned friends, former classmates, exes. No red flags, no recent arguments, no cryptic messages. Everyone said the same thing. Ava and Caleb were just normal, in love, focused, planning the future. But behind the scenes, detectives were growing increasingly frustrated. The crime scene, or what might have been one, had already been dismantled by the time the search began. Rides disassembled, ground flattened by trucks, tire tracks everywhere. If anything had happened that night, it was buried beneath metal plates, oil stains, and candy wrappers. On Friday, the sheriff's department held a press conference. Local news outlets carried the broadcast. They described the case as an active missing persons investigation and asked for public assistance. The families stood nearby, Caleb's mother visibly shaking, Ava's father clenching a rolled-up photo in his hands. Behind them, posters with their children's faces flapped gently in the wind. Then a reporter asked about the Ferris wheel operator, whether he was considered a suspect. The sheriff hesitated, then said only, "We're trying to locate him. That's all I can say." The carnival left town that night, packed up what was left and moved on to Illinois. Just another stop, just another weekend. As it rolled out of Red River, families watched from their driveways, wondering if the answers they needed were packed inside one of those trucks. And somewhere between the sound of engines and silence, suspicion turned to fear. Because if Victor Kane had nothing to hide, why did he run? Under growing scrutiny, and with national media starting to sniff around, the carnival's owner, an older man named Russell Dade, reluctantly turned over the company's time cards, employee logs, and a hand-drawn route map documenting their seasonal stops. Investigators had requested the materials earlier, but the delay was explained away as poor record-keeping. When they finally arrived, most of the logs looked hastily filled in. Some were typed, some scribbled in pen. Times didn't always match up. Names were spelled differently across documents. Dade claimed the workers often clocked in manually and weren't sticklers for details. To detectives, it already smelled like damage control. They began pulling apart the timeline of that night, using everything they could: ride schedules, shift rotations, internal checklists. Several employees had signed off on working the Ferris wheel between 10 p.m. and midnight, but only one of them, Victor Kane, the missing ride operator, was confirmed to be there at 11:15 when the Ferris wheel supposedly made its last run. The others gave overlapping stories. One claimed he was on break the whole time. Another said he was helping load equipment even though teardown hadn't begun. A food vendor said she saw Kane leave the Ferris wheel before it shut down. Another insisted he never left. Nobody could agree. Detectives started pushing harder. With Kane gone, the focus shifted to the crew around him. Workers who'd first seemed helpful now turned defensive. Some refused follow-up interviews. Others suddenly remembered things differently. A 22-year-old ride tech named Corey Denton told police he was sure he saw Caleb walking alone near the Porta-Johns after midnight, looking confused. But when asked why he didn't mention it earlier, Corey said he didn't think it mattered. Another crew member swore she saw Eva eating popcorn near the bumper cars around 11:30, but couldn't describe what she was wearing. A week earlier, that same woman told reporters she never saw the couple at all. A former detective brought in as a consultant, Paul Hensley, retired from the Indiana State Police, reviewed the interviews and logs. Off the record, he later told a reporter something that never made it into the case file. "It felt rehearsed," he said, "like someone handed out a script and nobody memorized their lines." Officially, the statements remained in the file. Unofficially, they only deepened suspicion. Then came a claim that, under different circumstances, might have been dismissed entirely. A local high schooler named Matt Sloan came forward to say that on the night of the disappearance, he was sneaking around the carnival after hours with two friends. At around 11:40 p.m., he said, he saw a girl matching Ava's description running barefoot between the tents near the back of the grounds. He said she looked scared, said she kept glancing behind her, but Matt didn't tell anyone until days later, too afraid of getting in trouble for trespassing. When questioned further, his story lacked specifics. He couldn't say where she went. His friends denied seeing anything. Investigators wrote it up as unconfirmed. The lead quietly died. By Thursday, cadaver dogs were brought back in for a second sweep, this time with a more focused directive. They'd already searched the area days earlier, but something had changed. On this pass, one of the dogs, trained specifically to detect human decomposition, alerted behind where the Ferris wheel had stood. It was a narrow strip of earth just beyond the ride's anchor point, partially hidden behind a stack of discarded boards and a deflated tarp. The ground was trampled, the grass patchy, flattened in wide circular marks. Investigators cordoned off the area and brought in a forensic team. Soil samples were collected. Metal detectors swept the ground. They used luminol in hopes of detecting blood residue. Nothing lit up. There were no visible signs of a struggle, no discarded items, no clothing fragments, no drag marks. Just the dog's repeated alerts to that same 10-foot area, always ending at the edge of a patch of dead grass that led nowhere. Later analysis of the soil returned inconclusive. Slight traces of human scent, the kind that could linger after prolonged contact, but no tissue, no fluids. The cadaver dog's handler would later describe the signal as strong but interrupted, as if the source had been quickly removed or buried shallow, then relocated. The Ferris wheel, which had stood in that exact spot, had already been dismantled days before. Investigators began to consider whether something had been hidden inside its base, but by the time they thought to look, the ride was already halfway across the state. The theory of an accident, some kind of fall, a ride malfunction, was ruled out early. There was no reported equipment failure, no calls for medical aid, no witnesses to anything violent or unusual. And yet, the smell of something wrong lingered, not metaphorically, literally. Officers noted a faint sour odor near the Ferris wheel base, present during the initial sweep, now gone. It was mentioned once in a field report, never followed up. Back at the station, whiteboards filled with disconnected lines and photos. Eva's smiling school portrait, Caleb holding a wrench in the garage, red string stretched toward crew rosters, route maps, scribbled timelines. Every hour accounted for, except the ones that mattered. Investigators returned to the logs again and again, cross-referencing timestamps, trying to find some unnoticed pattern. They found none. With each passing day, the theory that Caleb and Eva had simply wandered off became less believable. But without evidence, without bodies, it remained a missing persons case. The carnival had left town. The ride that may have held answers was gone, and the only person who might have known the truth had already disappeared. What haunted the investigators most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. By the second week of October, the carnival was gone. All that remained in the field behind County Road 18 were divots in the grass where the rides had once stood, a few cigarette butts, some faded duct tape, and the outline of Caleb's Civic in the dirt. Police tape had already been pulled down. The media trucks, once clustered along the fence line, had rolled out days earlier. The headlines moved on. Amber alerts expired. Reporters stopped calling. In Red River, life resumed, but not for everyone. Ava's mother, Teresa Martinez, began showing up to the field every night. Sometimes she'd sit in her car. Other times she stood just beyond where the Ferris wheel had been, silent, scanning the distance as if expecting someone to walk out of the trees. She brought candles, left flowers. On the 10th night, she brought Ava's childhood teddy bear. She laid it in the grass. When asked later why, she said, "In case she's cold." Caleb's older brother, Mason, dropped out of his sophomore year at Indiana Tech just before finals. He moved back into the family's basement and converted it into what he called a search command. Walls were soon covered in maps, timelines, and copies of police reports. He filed FOIA requests, made lists of every carnival stop before and after Red River, started calling law enforcement in other counties, asking if any other teens had gone missing in the weeks that followed. Some listened. Most didn't return his calls. 3 months in, the case began to erode from public memory. The local sheriff's department said they had no new leads. The FBI had no jurisdiction unless evidence of crossing state lines surfaced. Without bodies and without a crime scene, there was only speculation. The longer the silence dragged on, the louder the rumors grew. Someone claimed a blood-stained glove was found in a field near the edge of the fairgrounds. Photos even circulated online, a brown leather glove with a dark smear across the palm. But when police followed up, they found nothing. No physical item, no witness, no origin. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Another rumor said one of the carnival's trailers was never logged in the company manifest. A hidden trailer, off-grid, possibly stolen, possibly used for other things. A man from Ohio swore he'd seen it behind a junkyard near Dayton, chained shut. When investigators looked into it a year later, the entire lot had been cleared. No records were kept. The lead collapsed. Then came the story about a ride operator from the same carnival circuit who allegedly changed his name in 2004 and moved to Texas. He'd been connected to a different fairground incident, never charged, but it fueled speculation. His name wasn't Victor Kane, but people started to wonder if Kane was just another alias. Online forums exploded with theories. One YouTuber made a 3-part series connecting Eva and Caleb's disappearance to disappearances in other towns, Kankakee, Linton, Springdale, all within a 200-mile radius. Each involved a traveling carnival. Each case is unresolved. The families watched these videos. Some brought comfort. Most brought pain. Teresa once called into a live stream, begging people not to make entertainment out of her daughter's suffering. The host muted her halfway through. Years passed. Birthdays came and went. Ava's nursing. School sent a letter offering posthumous enrollment. Caleb's best friend got married and left a chair empty at the reception. The families stopped hoping for miracles. They just wanted something. An article of clothing, a fingerprint, a footprint in the woods. Anything. In 2008, a volunteer group led a ground-penetrating radar sweep of the original field. The effort was crowdfunded and unlicensed. They found nothing. One scanner picked up an anomaly, a patch of disturbed earth 8 feet deep. But excavation was denied. The land had since been leased to a farming company, and without police involvement, digging was a legal dead end. That same year, a woman claiming to be a psychic from Kentucky reached out to the Martinez family. She said Ava had visited her in a dream, said she was buried near water beneath metal and cold. The family gave the tip to the police. They logged it, then closed the file again. Every few years, new interest would spike. A podcast would revisit the case. A Reddit thread would go viral. Someone would claim to know someone who knew something. It never led anywhere. But each time, the families relived the first days all over again. The phone calls, the search parties, the last known footage. For Caleb's mother, the worst part wasn't not knowing if he was dead. It was not knowing if he had suffered. She told a local reporter once, "I just want to know if he was scared." No one had an answer. For Eva's father, it was the guilt. He'd been working late that night, said if he'd been home, maybe she would have stayed in. Maybe none of it would have happened. Teresa tried to console him, but over time their marriage began to fracture. They separated quietly in 2011. As for Mason, he never went back to school. He eventually took a job at a hardware store, still living at home, still updating his timeline every 6 months. He kept a folder labeled "Next Time," full of letters he planned to hand out if the carnival ever returned to Indiana. Flyers, questions, a worn-out photo of his brother, laminated. But the carnival never came back. The company dissolved in 2004, equipment sold off, workers disappeared into new aliases or new states. The Ferris wheel that may have been the last place Ava and Caleb were seen, gone, or stored, or rusting in a lot no one thought to search. What remained, 2 decades later, wasn't closure. It was silent. And in that silence, families still asked the same questions they'd asked on day one. What happened that night? And why did no one see them leave? In the summer of 2014, 12 years after Caleb Knox and Eva Martinez vanished from the Red River Carnival, a box was found in the basement of the Jackson County Records Office. It was unmarked on the outside, except for a faded sticky note with 4 words scrawled in black ink. 2002 Carnival Incident, Hold. The handwriting was stiff and unfamiliar, likely someone retired or long reassigned. The box had no barcode, no case number logged in the digital system. It wasn't supposed to be there. At the time, the records office was undergoing routine inventory cleanup. Old files were being digitized and reorganized by a new junior archivist, 27-year-old Dana Willis, who had transferred from another department just months prior. She wasn't from Red River. She didn't know the names Caleb or Eva, but curiosity did what protocol didn't. She opened the box. Inside were several sealed plastic sleeves containing physical photographs, paper-clipped reports, and handwritten memos. Most were undated. Others had the original Red River Sheriff's Department stamp, but no formal documentation attached. Many of the items didn't appear in the public case file. Dana wasn't supposed to review materials marked Hold without supervisory approval. But she kept going. What caught her attention were the photos. Close-up shots of carnival equipment being dismantled in haste. The angles were strange. Not surveillance, not news photos. These were detailed images taken from within the ride structures themselves. One showed a section of the Ferris wheel base covered in mud and rust. Another, more unsettling, focused on a narrow maintenance hatch beneath the central column. The latch was broken. A third photo, zoomed in and badly lit, revealed what looked like gouge marks along the interior of the ride's central shaft, deep, erratic, inconsistent with standard wear and tear. There was no explanation attached, no follow-up notes, no indication whether these findings were investigated. The documents that accompanied them were thin, a checklist of ride inspections marked incomplete, a single officer's name scribbled at the top, and an internal memo requesting temporary hold for pending review. But there was no signature and no review. Dana logged the discovery in the system, marked the box for review, and out of curiosity, typed the case name into a search engine. That's when she found the archived articles. The missing teens, the carnival, the operator who disappeared, and a Reddit forum that had kept the mystery alive for over a decade. Within a week, a Freedom of Information request was filed by Mason Knox. He'd been monitoring public databases since 2003, quietly renewing FOIA petitions every few years, just in case something turned up. This time, it did. The county, under legal obligation, reopened the physical evidence logs and acknowledged the previously unprocessed contents. It was the first official activity on the case in nearly 6 years. When Mason received the release packet, he knew immediately the photographs hadn't been part of the original file he'd been given in 2006. He recognized the layout of the Ferris wheel base, but not the damage, not the hatch, not the scratches. He drove 6 hours to the county building and requested to see the originals himself. What he saw haunted him. The scratch marks inside the EPTA rides column weren't random. They were concentrated around a narrow perimeter, just below shoulder height, and they curved in a way that suggested resistance, not mechanical friction, not structural damage, but as if something or someone had clawed at the metal from the inside. Some of the marks were straight and shallow. Others dug deep enough to curl flakes of steel outward. There was no soil around them, no oil residue, just raw abrasion. The maintenance hatch itself had clearly been tampered with. The bolts shown in the photo didn't match the manufacturer's specs, and the hinges were visibly warped. Whoever had taken the photo seemed to notice this too. A pen had been placed next to one of the bolts for scale, a crude attempt at documentation. But the angle and framing suggested the photographer wasn't a crime scene tech. They were someone already on site, possibly a deputy, possibly someone with knowledge of ride interiors. Mason sent the photos to an independent forensic consultant. The report came back with limited conclusions, no way to determine when the marks were made, or by what. But the expert did note one thing. If a person had been confined in the central shaft of that Ferris wheel while the ride was in motion, the injuries caused by friction and heat would have been catastrophic. There would have been no way to hear them over the sound of the engine, no way to see them unless someone opened the hatch. He handed the findings over to the sheriff's department. A detective reviewed the case file again. She confirmed that no one had ever formally searched the Ferris wheel itself. It had been removed from the site just 2 days after the disappearance and transported out of state with the rest of the carnival equipment. At the time, the focus had been on abduction. The rides weren't considered relevant. Now, 12 years later, they were. Officials attempted to locate the Ferris wheel's current whereabouts, but the carnival company, Horizon Thrills, had dissolved in 2004. Assets had been sold off at auction. No centralized records were kept. The trail was cold. Some rides were scrapped. Others were scattered in private collections across the Midwest. Finding one specific Ferris wheel became an uphill battle with no guarantee of success. Still, for the first time in over a decade, there was movement. The box, the photos, the scratches, they weren't proof, but they were possibilities. A sliver of something in a case long buried by silence. Mason printed out one of the photographs and pinned it above his desk, next to Caleb's senior portrait. It showed the hatch, slightly ajar, with a crowbar lying just beneath the frame. He stared at it for hours that night, because if someone had been inside that column, and if they tried to get out, then the question was no longer how Caleb and Eva disappeared. It was how many people never even knew they were there. By 2016, the trail was cold again. The Ibala scratches inside the Ferris wheel column had sparked a wave of renewed interest, but the momentum didn't last. Without the ride itself, there was no way to test theories, collect evidence, or confirm anything beyond speculation. The Ferris wheel was gone. The company that owned it no longer existed. Horizon Thrills had quietly dissolved in late 2004, just 2 years after Caleb and Eva vanished. There were no press releases, no investigations into why, just a paper trail of canceled insurance policies, asset liquidation forms, and a single line in a bankruptcy filing stating financial instability. In truth, it had slipped out of existence like so many traveling outfits do, forgotten, abandoned, erased from memory. The equipment was scattered. Some rides were scrapped for parts. Others were auctioned off in bulk to buyers across the Midwest. County records from Indiana to Missouri listed vague transactions: portable amusement device, used trailer, metal structure, origin unknown. There were no photos, no serial numbers. No one had kept a comprehensive inventory. Most buyers were private collectors or small-time showmen trying to keep their own carnivals alive. The trail disappeared into a fog of flea markets, rural auctions, and cash sales with no receipts. But in 2018, a message arrived in Teresa Martinez's inbox. It was short, polite, sent through the contact form of a website she'd forgotten was still live, one she'd created years ago to raise awareness about Eva's case. The message was from a man named Paul Renner, a retired welder from southern Illinois who collected carnival memorabilia. He claimed to have purchased an old Ferris wheel back in 2005 from a liquidation lot near the Missouri border. It had been in storage ever since, disassembled and sitting under tarp in his barn. He included 3 grainy photos. Teresa opened the first one and froze. The base platform was rusted through in spots, but the design was unmistakable. The alignment of the braces, the shape of the crossbars, the same faded red paint with thin yellow pinstriping. It looked exactly like the one from that night. In the second photo, a maintenance hatch was visible. Just beneath it, a deep curved gouge along the metal surface. Teresa stared at the screen, heart pounding, and called the detective assigned to the case within the hour. 2 days later, the Illinois State Police were on site. Renner, cooperative from the beginning, signed over the ride for examination. He never used it, said it was too large to assemble and hadn't run in over a decade. When asked if anyone else had accessed the storage space, he said only his son occasionally moved things in and out, but the ride had remained untouched since the day it arrived. Investigators documented the condition, photographed the structure, and began planning the transport. It took 4 weeks to coordinate the move. The Ferris wheel, now considered potential evidence in an open missing persons case, was disassembled piece by piece, labeled and secured for transport. It arrived at a state forensic facility in northern Indiana in November 2018. Engineers, forensic analysts, and structural specialists were brought in. It wasn't treated as a ride anymore. It was a crime scene. For nearly a year, the part sat under careful examination. Technicians scanned each beam for biological residue. X-rays were used on the central column to detect any voids or inconsistencies. DNA swabs were taken from every surface, even areas considered unreachable. The hatch was removed entirely and examined for signs of welding, repair, or tampering. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to analyze corrosion patterns, searching for any evidence that human remains had once been present. Every test took time. Some had to be repeated. Nothing could be rushed. Meanwhile, the families waited. Teresa kept her phone on full volume for 11 straight months, afraid she'd miss the call. Mason kept a spreadsheet of the investigation's progress, updating it obsessively every time he got a second-hand update. They tried not to get their hopes up, but for the first time in years, hope was no longer a hypothetical. In August 2019, preliminary results were submitted. There was no visible blood, no hair, no fingerprints. But in the inner seam of the central shaft, tucked between two panels that hadn't been separated in over a decade, lab technicians found fabric fragments embedded in oxidized grease. Tests confirmed it was human-made, a soft blend of cotton and polyester, blue in color. Thread patterns matched the general style of women's tops sold in the early 2000s. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. A second discovery came from the structural review. Anomalies were found in the weld pattern around the maintenance hatch. Forensic metallurgists confirmed that 2 welds had been added after factory production, with different alloy composition and inconsistent penetration. Amateur work, likely done in the field. The welds partially sealed the hatch from the outside. Not enough to keep it airtight, but enough to slow someone trying to open it from within. One final note in the report mentioned scratches along the inside rim. They matched the 2002 photographs from the unmarked box. Depths were consistent, angles aligned. The damage hadn't happened during disassembly. It had been inflicted before. No bones, no blood, no names. But something had happened inside that Ferris wheel. Authorities didn't call it a breakthrough. Officially, the findings were inconclusive, pending further evidence. But off the record, one detective admitted the team believed someone had been inside that shaft. Whether it was Eva, Caleb, or someone else, they didn't know. But someone had been there. The Ferris wheel was no longer a relic. It was a suspect. And somewhere, if it had been used more than once, it might not be the only one. The Ferris wheel had already been under forensic examination for 11 months when technicians made the decision to remove the inner metal casing at the core of the structure. The section was sealed shut with 2 heavy welds, sloppy, uneven, added post-manufacture. It took hours to slice through them without damaging what might be hidden inside. Most believed they were just covering structural wear, maybe added reinforcement from when the ride was transported between towns. No one expected to find anything significant. But behind the panel was a narrow cavity, no wider than an average duffel bag. It smelled of oil, rust, and age. At first glance, it appeared empty, but wedged deep inside the crevice, caught behind a lip of metal near the base, were several loose objects, so degraded by time and heat they were nearly unrecognizable. Forensics worked slowly. First, they recovered what looked like fabric, brittle, darkened with grime, but still intact enough to identify stitching. A floral pattern in faded shades of blue and white. The print matched a top Eva Martinez had been wearing the night she disappeared. Photographs from that night, given to investigators by her mother, showed the same neckline, same sleeve pattern. A forensic specialist confirmed the style was consistent with the 2002 retail collection sold by a local department store where Eva often shopped. Further in the compartment, embedded in rust flakes and flaking paint chips, were bone fragments. Not many. 4 in total. Small, irregular, and partially scorched, likely from prolonged exposure to the mechanical heat generated by the wheel. 2 of them were confirmed to be phalanges, finger bones. The others were too deteriorated to identify visually. The final item found was a gold bracelet, thin with a delicate clasp. The letters EM engraved on the underside are cursive. Eva's mother would later confirm it had been a gift from her aunt on her 17th birthday. She never took it off. It took less than a week for the DNA results to come back. Despite the condition of the material, mitochondrial testing provided a match. The bones belonged to Eva Martinez. The bracelet was hers. The scraps of clothing were confirmed by fiber analysis. It was no longer a missing persons case, and it was no longer just theory. The discovery made headlines, but authorities kept details contained. No photos were released, no press conference, just a short statement confirming that partial human remains had been identified inside the Ferris wheel, and the investigation into Eva Martinez's death had been formally reopened. No mention of Caleb. No trace of him had been found in the compartment. For her family, the news landed like a hammer. Teresa had always believed her daughter was dead, but knowing it and knowing how were 2 different things. The condition of the remains meant one thing clearly. Eva hadn't died instantly. The compartment wasn't wide enough for a body to rest comfortably. It was hidden, suffocating, and sealed from the outside. Someone had put her there. Someone had welded it shut. That fact alone shifted the investigation back to where it had started. The Carnival crew. Specifically, Victor Kane, the Ferris wheel operator who vanished just days after Eva and Caleb disappeared. With fresh evidence on hand, police reopened their records on Kane and sent a renewed request to the National Crime Information Center for identity cross-referencing. Within 3 days, they got a hit. Victor Kane didn't exist, but Leo Hartwell did. He'd been born in Nebraska, served time for burglary in the early 90s, and had a documented history of using aliases while working on traveling crews. Between 1997 and 2004, he'd worked under at least 4 different names with 3 different carnivals. Each time he left abruptly. No forwarding address, no formal termination, just gone. But what stood out wasn't just his mobility. It was where he'd been when other disappearances occurred. In 1999, 16-year-old Bryn Calloway vanished from a county fair outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. She was last seen getting off a tilt-a-whirl, heading toward the back of the grounds. Her remains were never found. In 2001, a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Dent disappeared from a carnival in rural Iowa. His car was left behind. No exit footage, no leads. Police suspected a runaway. He was never located. Both towns had hosted the same traveling outfit Hartwell worked for. In both cases, ride logs later showed he'd been operating or repairing equipment near the last known sighting of the missing teens. And in both cases, he vanished from the area less than a week later. At the time, the disappearances were unconnected. Different states, different crews, no physical evidence. But now, with Ava's remains confirmed inside the ride Hartwell last operated, investigators had a pattern, a method, and a suspect with the skills and opportunity to carry it out. Hartwell had welding experience, mechanical knowledge, and a pattern of disappearing just as suspicions began to form. But locating him now, over a decade later, proved difficult. His last known alias was linked to a motel registration in Missouri in 2005. After that, nothing. Law enforcement began circulating aged-up sketches, pushing his profile to agencies across the country. Cold case units in multiple states reopened dormant files. A task force was proposed, but never fully funded. The trail was thin, and time wasn't on their side. And still the biggest question remained unanswered. What happened to Caleb? He wasn't found in the compartment. No trace of his DNA. No clothing. No items that could be linked to him. Theories emerged. Maybe he escaped. Maybe he was taken somewhere else, or maybe he was never placed in the ride to begin with. But those were guesses. In reality, investigators had nothing. For Ava's family, it was a partial ending, one they hadn't asked for, but one they'd learned to accept. Her bracelet was returned, her bones cremated. A quiet memorial was held in the same field where she vanished 16 years earlier. But for Mason, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Because if Hartwell had sealed Eva inside that ride, alone, then Caleb might have seen it happen. He might have tried to stop it. He might have been taken elsewhere. Or worse, he might still be out there, waiting to be found. With Eva's remains confirmed and the compartment exposed, the case was no longer just a disappearance. It was now officially classified as a homicide. The focus shifted entirely to one name: Leo Hartwell, a man who had once gone by Victor Kane, a man who had stood just feet from the last place Ava and Caleb were seen alive, a man who vanished before he could be questioned and who had left behind a pattern that no one recognized until it was too late. Investigators pulled every trace they could find: his original birth certificate from Nebraska, arrest records from the early 90s, a forged driver's license under the Kane alias, and a social security number that belonged to someone who died in 1983. His fingerprints were incomplete, partial records from a misdemeanor charge years before, but enough to establish a link across state databases. What they found next was staggering. Between 1998 and 2004, at least 7 teenagers had vanished from small towns hosting traveling carnivals that Hartwell had worked for. In some cases, the disappearances were dismissed as runaways. In others, there were brief investigations that never connected the dots. Different jurisdictions, different states, no shared system at the time. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and a suspect finally named, the similarities began to emerge. The missing were all between the ages of 16 and 20. Most disappeared late at night, within walking distance of the fairgrounds. No signs of struggle, no clear exits, no witnesses, just gone. Their names had faded from headlines and memory until now. Bryn Calloway from Oklahoma, Marcus Dent from Iowa, Tyrell Grayson from Michigan. All of them disappeared during the same months Hartwell was confirmed to be working under various aliases, all of them from towns that sat along the carnival's route. Law enforcement pieced together route maps, interviewing surviving managers, digging into dusty rosters. But after the dissolution of Horizon Thrills in 2004, records became scarce. The carnival industry wasn't known for meticulous documentation. Many of the people who worked those jobs were paid under the table, moved constantly, and left behind little more than first names and burner numbers. Still, they tried. One former employee, a woman named Gina Coates, worked concessions for part of 2002 and 2003. She didn't know Hartwell by name, but when shown a photo, she recognized him instantly. "That guy?" she told the detectives. "He always wanted to stay late. Said he liked fixing things when no one was around. She remembered him bringing his own tools. Said he had a habit of wandering off during teardown and sometimes stayed overnight in ride compartments to save money on motels." At the time, no one thought anything of it. Police, now armed with Hartwell's known locations, identified a junkyard in rural Indiana where an old spinning ride had been left to rot after being sold off. Records showed Hartwell had performed maintenance on it the same weekend. A 17-year-old girl disappeared 2 towns over. The ride had been exposed to the elements for more than a decade, half buried in rust and overgrowth. Still, they brought in cadaver dogs, metal detectors, and forensic anthropologists. Nothing was found. The search left investigators frustrated, but it didn't close the door. If anything, it confirmed a suspicion that Hartwell knew exactly what he was doing. He chose rides with sealed spaces, maintenance hatches, hidden compartments, places no one would think to check until it was too late. And once the ride moved on, so did he. By late 2019, The manhunt for Hartwell had quietly escalated. He was now suspected in at least 4 disappearances, potentially more. His photo was aged and distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. A tip line was set up. Flyers were mailed to scrapyards, fairgrounds, and county law offices, anywhere he might have once passed through. The FBI updated his profile, classifying him as a fugitive and person of interest in a multi-jurisdictional homicide case. But Hartwell had vanished in 2005. His last known sighting was a motel registration in Branson, Missouri, using the name Clay Hollis. Surveillance footage from that week was overwritten. The credit card he used belonged to a stolen identity. The trail ended there. Investigators believed he may have crossed into Mexico or changed identities again, or he might be living quietly under another alias, somewhere in plain sight. For Eva's mother, the discovery reopened everything: the grief, the rage, the waiting. She started writing open letters to Hartwell and posting them online. Each one was dated and signed from Eva's mom. She wrote directly to him, pleaded, dared him to come forward, asked him if he remembered her daughter's voice. She posted pictures of Eva as a child, her favorite songs, her laugh. "You locked her in the dark," one letter read. "You think that makes you powerful. But I still say her name out loud. You don't get to bury that." Caleb's family, meanwhile, refused to accept that he was dead. Mason in particular clung to the fact that no trace of Caleb had been found, no bones, no scrap of clothing, no evidence that he had been inside the compartment with Eva. He believed Caleb had tried to stop Hartwell, that he had seen something he wasn't supposed to, that he might have been taken somewhere else, or escaped. Mason began digging again, revisiting leads, tracking old carnival stops Hartwell might have passed through. Every ride that went into storage, every trailer that had gone unsold. He believed the answer was still out there. And the more they looked, the more they began to wonder how many rides had been welded shut over the years, how many compartments had never been opened, how many families were still waiting for answers they didn't even know they needed. The silence Hartwell left behind wasn't just suspicious, it was calculated. It was part of the pattern. And now, with his name tied to a chain of forgotten cases, the question wasn't whether he would resurface. It was how many names would be attached to him before he did. In January of 2023, a user on a true crime message board uploaded a single photo to a thread that, for 2 decades, had followed the unsolved disappearance of Caleb Knox and Eva Martinez. The user claimed they'd found the photo while cleaning out a trailer on a remote property in rural Iowa. The trailer had been abandoned for years, its roof partially collapsed, walls blackened by an old fire that hadn't been officially reported. Inside, beneath a warped floorboard, was a plastic bag filled with water-damaged documents and a stack of photos, most too faded to be useful. But one image stood out. It showed the inside of what looked like a cluttered work trailer, peeling linoleum, old wiring, carnival parts stacked in the corner. On the right, slumped near a wall, was a teenage boy, shirtless, thin, bruised across the jaw and ribs. His wrists bore red marks, and behind him, partly visible in the frame, was a curved metal piece consistent with the structural frame of a Ferris wheel compartment. Within hours, someone matched the part to a ride used by Horizon Thrills. Then came the speculation. The boy looked like Caleb. The eyes, the ears, the angle of his nose. A hobbyist ran the photo through free facial recognition software and posted the results. 82% match to Caleb Knox, based on yearbook images from 2001. It wasn't conclusive, but it was close enough to make people stop and look twice. The original photo was turned over to authorities. Forensic experts confirmed that it was real, printed on paper consistent with consumer photo stock sold in early 2003. No edits, no signs of forgery. The date matched the timeline, but the trailer it came from had burned at least a decade earlier. There were no fingerprints left, no identifying information, no DNA recovered. It was a dead end before it could become a lead. Still, the resemblance shook people. Mason Knox was the first to go public. He said it was Caleb. He said he recognized the angle of his brother's shoulders, the shape of his hands. Eva's mother wasn't sure. She said it was possible, but part of her didn't want it to be. If it was him, it meant he'd been alive, that he'd survived what she hadn't, and that someone had kept him hidden. Investigators reopened the file quietly. The image was sent through federal channels, enhanced, analyzed, and compared against missing persons databases. No other matches were found. But without confirmation, they couldn't declare it was Caleb. And without a body, they couldn't say what had happened to him. They just had a face, and a silence too long to explain. Online, the theories flooded in. Some believed Caleb had been held captive and eventually escaped, then went into hiding. Others suggested the photo was taken shortly before his death. Some believed Hartwell, or someone like him, had kept Caleb alive as leverage, or worse, had forced him to help. Theories multiplied, but facts stayed thin. And still, the photo remained the only new trace of Caleb Knox in over 20 years. He hadn't aged, he hadn't spoken, he hadn't left a note behind, just a single frame, buried in a trailer, lost to fire, and found too late. A boy with nothing around him but broken machinery, bruises, and silence. No one knows who took the photo, or why they kept it. But if the boy in that trailer was Caleb, then someone else was in the room with him. In 2025, a forensic team revisiting the dismantled Ferris wheel made one final discovery. Near the base of the central column, beneath a corroded section of metal, they uncovered a narrow compartment missed in earlier examinations. Inside, wrapped in rotted canvas and hardened by time, was a small notebook. Its pages warped, the ink smudged, but still legible in parts. The writing was confirmed as Eva Martinez's. The first page was dated the night she disappeared. She didn't write like someone who was planning to run. She wrote like someone waiting in the dark. One entry read, "We're trapped. He knows we saw something. Caleb says we wait till 2 a.m. Another described the sound of welding, a glimpse of boots through a vent, a bleeding hand. Then, silence. The final page held only one line. If someone finds this, he's still out there. Investigators confirmed the authenticity. The ink matched the pens she was known to use. The paper came from a notebook brand sold in town that same year, and just above the last page, smudged into the corner, was a faded fingerprint. It was hers. The notebook didn't solve the case, but it proved something critical. Ava hadn't been alone. Caleb had been with her, alive, trying to protect her. He had seen something, and someone had made sure he never spoke about it again. Caleb Knox was never found. His name remains in national missing persons databases. No evidence has surfaced to confirm what happened after that night, but Ava's words left something behind, an echo, a trace. She wrote it in fear. She wrote it for someone to find. And now that it's been read, the question is no longer what happened. It's who still remembers.